In 1937, while most Americans faced old age with nothing waiting for them, a railroad water boy who never earned more than $1 a day could one day retire with a government pension that outlasted him. The Railroad Retirement Act made it law. Long before Social Security checks were a sure thing, the men who built and ran America's railroads had something almost nobody else did: security for life. But here's what nobody tells you. Number 4 on this list was so dangerous, the railroads kept the grim tallies of the men it killed, and most who did it never lived to collect a dime. And number 11 had its own secret language, a rhythm and a chant that could bend steel. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because these are the forgotten men who earned their pension the hard way. Let's count down. Number 25. Before machines did the heavy lifting, section gangs sweating under the summer sun depended on one small figure: the water boy. Often a boy of 10 or 12, he carried a wooden bucket and a tin dipper up and down the line, bringing relief to men swinging spike mauls in 100-degree heat. He earned pennies a day, maybe 50 cents if the foreman was generous, but he was on the railroad's rolls. Oral histories recall boys walking miles of track, balancing sloshing pails, bare feet on hot ballast, learning the rhythm of the gang before they were old enough to lift a rail. Many started here and never left, climbing from water boy to section hand to foreman across 40 years. And because the railroad counted those years, a man who began carrying water in 1910 could retire in 1950 with a pension no farmhand or factory boy his age could dream of. Number 24. Every long-distance passenger train carried a news butcher, a boy or young man working the aisles with a wicker basket of newspapers, chewing gum, oranges, cigars, and sandwiches. He wasn't paid a salary so much as a cut of the sales, but the big lines put him on the payroll and his years counted. A young Thomas Edison famously started out this way. Oral histories recall the patter, the cry of headlines down a swaying coach, the theatrical way a good butcher could sell a dime magazine to a bored traveler crossing Kansas. He learned every station and every timetable before most boys finished school. When the automobile emptied the passenger cars in the 1950s, the news butcher vanished almost overnight. But those who stayed with the railroad, who moved into other departments, carried those early years with them and toward a retirement check that outlasted the trains they once worked. Number 23. Nearly every man who ever pulled the throttle of a steam locomotive began, most likely, as a wiper. It was the lowest job in the roundhouse. Armed with a fistful of cotton waste and a can of oil, the wiper scrubbed grease, soot, and grime off cold engines for 10 hours a shift. The pay was poor, maybe $1.50 a day in 1915, and the work filthy enough that a man came home black to the elbows. But the wiper's job was the first rung on the ladder. From wiper to hostler to fireman to engineer, that was the path, and every ambitious young man knew it by heart. Oral histories recall the pride a wiper took in a gleaming boiler, hoping the foreman would notice. Thankless as it was, it put a boy on the railroad's rolls, and the railroad never forgot the years a man gave it. Number 22. Before electric signals, the railroad ran on flame, and the lampman tended it. Sometimes called the lamplighter, he cared for hundreds of oil lamps, the red and green markers on the rear of cabooses, the switch lamps that glowed at every junction, the signal lamps strung along the line. Each had to be cleaned, filled with kerosene, trimmed and lit, night after night, in every kind of weather. Oral histories recall men crossing dark yards with a ladder and an oil can, breath fogging in the winter cold, coaxing a stubborn wick to catch. A single unlit switch lamp could send a train onto the wrong track and into disaster, so the work demanded a care no passenger ever saw. Electric lighting erased the job by the 1930s, but the lamp men who kept the yards glowing had steady work for decades and the pension that came with putting in the years. Number 21. Beneath the roundhouse ran the ash pit, and the man who worked it held one of the dirtiest jobs on the railroad. When a steam engine came in, its firebox and ash pans were full of glowing cinders and clinkers. The cinder pit man, the ash cat, raked the burning ash down into the pit, hosed it with water that erupted in scalding steam, then shoveled the sodden mess out by hand. The heat was brutal, the dust choking, and the work never stopped because the engines never stopped. Oral histories recall men black with ash from cap to boot, coughing grit for hours after a shift, working through the night so the morning engines ran clean. It was the kind of job nobody bragged about. But it was steady, it was union, and every hour counted toward the day a man could finally set down the shovel for good. Number 20. Before the telephone reached every home, the railroad woke its crews with a boy on a bicycle. The call boy carried a list of names and addresses, and when a train needed a crew, he pedaled through dark streets to knock on doors, rousing engineers, firemen, and brakemen for shifts that began at 3 a.m. He had to get a signature, or at least a grunt of acknowledgement, then race to the next house because a train that missed its crew cost the railroad money. Oral histories recall boys biking miles in rain and snow, dodging dogs, learning which men answered quick and which cursed through the door. It was how many started, a foot in the door of the operating department. And that foot, once inside, could carry a boy up the ranks and all the way to a pension nobody outside the railroad quite understood. Number 19. Every freight car rode on axles that turned inside journal boxes, small compartments packed with oil-soaked cotton waste that kept the bearings cool. If a box ran dry, the axle heated until it glowed, seized, and could snap, derailing the whole train. The oiler walked the yards with a long spouted can and a hook, opening each box, checking the packing, topping off the oil. Oral histories recall men moving down a mile-long string of cars, box after box, in a rhythm built over years, hands permanently stained. A hot box was every railroader's dread, and the oiler was the quiet line of defense against it. Roller bearings eventually made the job obsolete, but the men who packed journal boxes through the steam years kept the trains rolling and safe and earned every dollar of the retirement the railroad promised them. Number 18. Long before ultrasonic rail detectors, the safety of the line depended on one man and his eyes. The track walker patrolled his stretch of railroad on foot, day after day, looking for cracked rails, loose spikes, washed-out ballast, and shifting ties. He carried a hammer and a few simple tools, tightening what he could and reporting what he couldn't. In storm season, he walked in the worst of it, checking that no flood had undermined the roadbed before the night express came through. Oral histories recall men who walked the same 10 miles for 30 years, who knew every curve and culvert by heart, who could feel through their boots when something was wrong. It was lonely, tiring, endless work. But it saved lives no one ever counted, and it gave a plain man a place on the railroad and a pension at the end of the walk. Number 17. Before mechanical refrigeration, America's meat, fruit, and milk moved in refrigerator cars cooled by ice, and someone had to load it. At icing stations along the main lines, the icing crew hauled 300-pound blocks of ice up onto the tops of the reefer cars, chopped and cramming them into the bunkers at each end, sometimes salting them to drop the temperature further. The work was frantic and cold-burned, done against the clock because a train couldn't wait and the produce couldn't warm. Oral histories recall men on icy catwalks in July, arms aching, racing a whole string of cars before the whistle blew. A big icing platform could re-ice 100 cars in an hour. Mechanical refrigeration killed the job by the 1960s. But for decades, the icing crews kept America's food from spoiling and kept themselves on the road to a railroad pension. Number 16. Between the wiper and the engineer stood the hostler, the man who moved locomotives around the yard and roundhouse but never took them out on the main line. When an engine came in, the hostler ran it onto the turntable, spun it, backed it into its stall, then took it to the coal chute, the water tank, and the sandhouse, and had it ready for the road crew. He knew engines cold, but his authority ended at the yard limits. Oral histories recall hostlers who could thread a 100-ton locomotive through a crowded roundhouse in the dark by feel and by ear. For many, it was the last step before the engineer's seat, the proving ground where a man showed he could handle steam. And every year spent hostling counted, dollar for dollar, toward the pension the operating men prized above all. Number 15. As railroads laced the country with automatic block signals, a new craftsman appeared, the signal maintainer. He kept the line-side signals, the track circuits, the relays, and the batteries working, a job that mixed electrician, mechanic, and detective. A single failed relay could stop all traffic, or worse, show a false clear. So the maintainer patrolled his territory in a small motor car, testing, adjusting, and replacing, often called out at midnight when a storm knocked a signal dark. Oral histories recall men who understood the invisible logic of the railroad, the circuits that let trains follow one another safely with no human in sight. It was skilled, respected work that paid better than the section gang. And because signals only grew more important as the years passed, the maintainer had steady employment and a secure retirement waiting at the end of the line. Number 14. Walk through any old rail yard and you'd hear it, the ring of a hammer against steel. That was the car knocker, the car inspector, tapping the wheels of every car with a long-handled hammer and listening. A clear ring meant a solid wheel. A dull thud meant a crack that could shatter under load and wreck a train. He also checked brakes, couplers, and journal boxes, crawling under cars in all weather to keep the train safe to run. Oral histories recall men who could diagnose a bad wheel by ear alone, a skill built over thousands of taps. The nickname was rough, but the work was vital and skilled. Car knockers put in long careers in the yards, rain or shine, day and night. And every one of those years the railroad set aside, so a man who spent his life tapping wheels could rest easy at the end of it. Number 13. At busy junctions and yard throats, before machines threw the switches, a man did it by hand. The switch tender stood at his post in every kind of weather, reading train orders and signals, throwing the heavy iron levers that guided each train onto the right track. A single mistake could put two trains on the same rail. So the job demanded constant attention and steady nerve, often through 12-hour shifts in a tiny shanty warmed by a coal stove. Oral histories recall men who worked the same interlocking for decades, who knew every regular train by its whistle. The pay was modest but dependable, and the responsibility was enormous. When power switches and centralized control took over, the switch tender faded away. But he had held one of the most trusted positions on the railroad and drew a pension to match a lifetime of getting it right. Number 12. Every steam locomotive drank enormous amounts of water, and along lonely stretches of line stood the water tanks that kept them running. The tank tender maintained them, filling the wooden tank from a well or a stream, tending the pump, and in winter fighting to keep the water from freezing solid. Many lived right beside their tank in a small company house, miles from the nearest town. Their whole world, the trains that stopped to drink. Oral histories recall families raising children in the shadow of a water tank, the father climbing the frozen ladder at dawn to break the ice before the first engine arrived. It was isolated, unglamorous work. But it was essential to every train that passed, and it put an ordinary man on the railroad's rolls in country where jobs were scarce, with the same pension the big city crews earned. Number 11. This was the muscle that built and held the railroad together. The Gandhi dancers were the track laborers who lifted, aligned, and spiked the rails by hand, and they did it to rhythm. A caller would sing out, and the whole gang would heave their lining bars in unison, nudging heavy steel rails a fraction of an inch into perfect line. The chants, passed down and improvised on the spot, turned brutal labor into something almost musical, and it was those songs that gave the work its secret language. Oral histories recall the sound of a gang working a summer morning, the caller's voice and the ring of steel carrying across the fields. The pay was low, the work backbreaking, the sun merciless. But the Gandhi dancers were on the railroad, and the railroad counted their years, so even the men at the very bottom could climb toward a pension for life. Number 10. The heart of a steam locomotive was its boiler, and the boilermaker kept it alive. Working inside the cramped, dark firebox or hammering rivets on the shell, he patched leaks, replaced flues, and rebuilt boilers that endured pressures and heat capable of killing in an instant if the metal ever failed. It was dangerous, deafening work. A man crawling inside a still warm boiler, chipping scale, driving red-hot rivets with a bucking hammer that left his hands numb for years. Oral histories recall Boilermakers half-deaf by 50, proud of engines that ran 1,000,000 miles on their repairs. It was a true trade, learned over a long apprenticeship, and it paid accordingly. Dieselization gutted the craft in the 1950s, but the Boilermakers who kept the steam fleet safe had earned skilled wages, and a retirement the whole country's factory hands would have envied. Number 9, for a century the railroad ran on the telegraph, and the operator was its voice. Sated at a key in a depot or a lonely tower, he received the train orders that governed every movement, copying them in a fast, clean hand as the dots and dashes clattered in, repeating them back, then handing them up to passing crews on a hooped stick. A single misheard word could kill. Oral histories recall operators who could read the wire in their sleep, who knew every man on the division by his fist, the personal rhythm of his sending. The job demanded literacy, speed, and iron nerves, and it opened the door to becoming a dispatcher or a station agent. When the telephone and the radio replaced Morse code, the brass key fell silent. But the operators had held the railroad's nervous system in their fingertips and retired with the pension that honored it. Number 8, where many lines crossed and tangled, the railroad built interlocking towers, and inside sat the tower operator, the leverman. Before him stood a great frame of levers, mechanically locked so he couldn't set two conflicting routes at once, and with them he threw switches and cleared signals for train after train. It was like conducting an orchestra of steel, sometimes routing dozens of trains an hour through a junction without a single delay or collision. Oral histories recall operators who worked a busy tower for 30 years, who could see a whole railroad in their heads and never make a wrong move. The physical strength to throw the heavy levers, the memory, the calm under pressure, few men could do it. Centralized traffic control eventually emptied the towers, but those who worked them held a place of high trust and a pension that reflected it. Number 7. In thousands of small towns, the railroad's public face was the station agent, and often the depot was the busiest building in the county. He sold tickets, handled freight and express, worked the telegraph, wired money, kept the accounts, and knew everyone's business coming and going. In many towns, he doubled as newsman and confidant all at once. Oral histories recall agents who ran their depots single-handed for 40 years, who could tell you when the next train was due without glancing at the clock. The job carried real standing in the community and steady pay, a respectable middle rung of railroad life. When highways and trucks emptied the small depots, the agencies closed one by one. But the station agent had spent a career at the center of town life and drew a railroad pension that let him stay there in comfort long after the last train stopped. Number 6. Feeding a moving hotel took genius, and it happened in a galley barely wider than a hallway. The dining car cook turned out full multi-course meals, steaks, chops, fresh biscuits, elaborate desserts, on a coal and later a gas range, in a kitchen that pitched and swayed at 70 miles an hour. Space was so tight that a crew of 4 moved in a choreographed dance, pots sliding, knives flashing, never colliding. Oral histories recall cooks who plated hundreds of dinners between stations, who kept white tablecloth standards while the whole room rocked. Many were black men who found in the dining car a rare path to steady, respectable wages in an era that offered them little. The dining car has all but vanished, but the men who cooked in that swaying galley earned skilled pay, protected hours, and the railroad pension that came with the years. Number 5. No railroad job carried more dignity won against greater odds than the Pullman porter. Almost entirely black men, porters made up beds, shined shoes, served meals, and looked after passengers around the clock on the sleeping cars, often for long hours and low base pay, dependent on tips and forced to answer to any name a passenger chose to use. Yet the job was, for decades, one of the best a black man could get in America, a genuine ticket to the middle class. Oral histories recall porters who put their children through college, who carried news and dignity across the country. In 1937, after a 12-year fight, A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters won a landmark labor contract, better wages, real hours, and a place in the railroad's pension system. The porters had earned, through patience and struggle, security for life. Number 4. Before the air brake, stopping a train meant men on the roofs. At the whistle signal, brakemen scrambled along the tops of moving freight cars, spinning the handbrake wheels one by one, leaping the gaps between cars in the dark, in the rain, in the ice. Coupling cars meant standing between them with the old link and pin, and countless brakemen lost fingers, hands, and lives doing it. The railroads kept the grim tallies. It was said to be one of the deadliest jobs in America, and many who did it never lived to collect a dime of retirement. Oral histories recall the missing fingers that marked a veteran brakeman, worn like a hard badge, The air brake and the automatic coupler finally tamed the danger. Those who survived long enough moved up to conductor and reached, at last, the pension so many of their brothers never saw. Number 3. Beside every engineer sat the fireman, the tallow pot, and his whole job was to feed the fire. On a hard run, he shoveled coal, tons of it, from the tender into the firebox by hand, reading the fire and the water glass to keep steam pressure exactly right up every grade. It was punishing, endless labor in a cab that was freezing on one side and blazing on the other. Oral histories recall firemen who threw 16 tons of coal on a single mountain division, arms like iron, faces lit orange by the open firebox door. But the fireman was also the engineer in training, learning the road, the signals, and the machine mile by mile. Every good engineer had first been a fireman. It was the hardest apprenticeship in America, and it led straight to the throttle and to one of the surest pensions a working man could hold. Number 2. The conductor was the captain of the train. Whatever the engineer did up front, it was the conductor who was in command, responsible for the crew, the cars, the passengers, the orders, and the safe running of the whole train. He collected the tickets, kept the paperwork, made the decisions when something went wrong, and answered for all of it. Oral histories recall conductors in their brass-buttoned coats, gold watch in hand, calling the stations and running their trains like clockwork for 40 years. It took long service and a spotless record to reach the conductor's rank, usually after years as a brakeman. The pay was among the best on the railroad, and the respect greater still. When a conductor finally hung up his watch, he retired on a pension that reflected a lifetime of command, security few American workers of his generation ever knew. Number 1. And at the very top stood the man every wiper, hostler, and fireman dreamed of becoming, the locomotive engineer. His hand on the throttle, he held the lives of everyone aboard and the fate of every train he met on the line. He knew his engine like his own body, felt every grade and curve through the frame, ran to the second by a watch he trusted with his life. It took 20 years to get there, wiper to hostler to fireman to engineer, a climb few completed and none quickly. Oral histories recall engineers who ran the same division for decades, waved to by children at every crossing, the most respected working men in their towns. The pay was the best on the railroad, and the pension the finest of all. He had started, most likely, as a boy wiping grease off a cold engine. He ended as an American legend and retired for life. That's the forgotten world that built America, 25 jobs, one railroad, and a pension almost no other worker of the age could claim. The steam is gone, and the roundhouses are silent, but the men who gave their lives to the rails earned something that outlasted the trains. Which of these did your grandfather do? Tell me in the comments, and if this brought back a memory, hit subscribe. There's more of this vanished America still to come.